Well, we're finishing this. The title of this message is Following the Good Shepherd. We took Psalm 23 last week and we discussed the first of 3 points, which was the provision of the shepherd. We find that in the first 3 verses of Psalm 23. Let me read them to you again. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So that was his provision in our lives. It was a great lesson to me to rehearse how God provides for us, especially in times of grief. We want to go now to the second half of that psalm and discuss the last 2 points, the second being the presence of the shepherd. And there's a noticeable change in this psalm in verse 4. The first one is kind of, green pastures, still waters, it's all but sunny skies and bright days. And then it takes an ominous change in verse 4, and the verses are longer. Even the way that the verses are given to us are changed. Is there in a second or third person in the first 3 verses, and then it changes to a first person perspective. Now it's not about something's happening out here. This is my point of view now. Pick it up in verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So we're going to look at the presence of the shepherd there. And that reference, that very familiar reference there to the valley of the shadow of death brings about different thoughts to different people. To some of us, it strikes fear in our heart. There's some people that are literally afraid of death and are fixated on death, and they're afraid to die, and they're overly concerned about it. My own mother, I didn't know this till after the fact. My own mother, for some reason along her life's journey, picked up this notion that she would not outlive her father, my grandfather, who, as you recall, was the preacher. He was a preacher, and she grew up in a preacher's home, and she greatly respected and admired her father. And yet she took a different path in life and strayed from what she had been taught and been given and been entrusted with as a preacher's daughter. And for some reason along the way, she felt like, as a judgment of God, for her straying from the path that her mother and father had set for her life, that she would not outlive her father. She didn't share this with any of us, and neither my brothers nor I. And it was only until after the date, literally not the year, but the month and date passed, that she called me up and she confided in me that for especially the last year and a half or so, she had been convinced that she was going to die. And I said, "What are you talking about, Mom?" She said, "Well, I just knew in my heart that I would not live longer than my dad. He was a great man, and he served God." She had since made her peace with God, and we had many discussions about her walk with the Lord. She was growing in her walk with the Lord. But for many years, she had strayed from the path that her parents had tried to take her, and certainly the Bible had showed her. And she felt like she was unworthy to live past the age of her father. So you say, "Pastor, what did you say to her?" I said, "Mom," I said, I quoted to her Hebrews 9:27, "And as it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment." I said, "Mom, I wish you had shared this with me. I wish you had confided with me about these reservations and fears you were having all this time, because God has an appointed time for all of us. We don't know when that will be. We're just to live our lives to our fullest and do everything we can to serve the Lord with our lives. But you need not have worried about this, especially in this last several months as she was convinced she was going to die. She was literally overcome with fear of dying. And ultimately, 2 or 3 years later, she passed away, but she passed away peacefully in her sleep one night. She just went to bed and didn't get up the next morning. And that's how the Lord took her. But I thought there's some people that are just, when you hear that phrase, the valley of the shadow of death, it just strikes fear in their hearts. And other people who have a biblical perspective, and certainly those who have made their peace with God, look at that valley as an opportunity for God to be with us and show himself strong in our lives and to take us through whatever deep waters we go through, whatever tough times we go through. That valley for some of us, and some of you have traveled that valley, and maybe traveling it now, is a way for God to draw you closer to him. It's all a matter of perspective. And isn't that what this whole study has been about, this study on grief? It's about a perspective. It's about getting our eyes off of the waves and the storm and getting our eyes on the Lord Jesus Christ and allowing him to grow us through our difficulties and helping us through. So we want to look at the reality of these valleys. The image that we have there it has some dangers, no doubt. As you think back to the context of the sheep, those mountain areas and those deep valleys carried with it a number of concerns for a shepherd in watching over his sheep. One thing that might come into play are those flash floods. Having not lived in real mountainous terrain before in my life, I don't appreciate it perhaps as much as I should, but there are people who live in regions where if they are caught in a valley during a time of heavy rain, they could literally be swept to their death. And sheep in particular have no way of getting out of that quickly. There's the ever-present loose stones and rocks as these sheep are making their way. They're not goats. Goats are remarkable at climbing up mountainous terrains. They're very agile and do far better than we do in getting around in that terrain. Sheep, not so much. The way that sheep are built, they have those short legs and skinny legs, and they're top heavy, and they can lose their balance easily. And for some sheep, that means tumbling down the side of a mountainside, getting injured or even dying. There's that ever-present danger. There's that rugged terrain. There's the danger of predators lurking about. The analogy used here by David in writing about the circumstances were very familiar to him, that these sheep needed to depend upon the shepherd to get through these dangerous, dark times in their lives. It may not be, the valley of the shadow of death may not be death itself. It may just be the potential of death. It fits in that category. Remember I shared with you a while ago of the many things we worry about in life? The 85% of things we worry about in life that never come about. We think we're going to be in these difficult times, and it just doesn't play out the way we think it's going to do. So to the child of God, every type of grief carries with it some element of danger with it. Just uncertainty. What if this happens? And you look at case scenarios and potential outcomes, and you're afraid to make wrong decisions in times like that. And for those of us in our church ministry who've gone through that valley in recent months since we started this series, you're well acquainted with the potential that you have to make difficult decisions that may have negative consequences. That valley of grief is dark and uncertain. And while we travel through it, it is compounded by the fact that Satan will use our vulnerable situation to fire his darts at us, to make it worse than it needs to be, and worse than we want it to be, worse than it already is. He'll take our vulnerable situation, like vulnerable sheep, and he'll fire things into our lives to make it even more difficult for us. He wants us to quit. He wants you to give up. He wants you to despair. He wants you to stop serving the Lord. He wants you to abandon your convictions and your principles, and that often happens during a time of deep grief. People's lives get very unsettled, and they don't know where it's going to ultimately end up down the road. Ephesians 6:16 says, above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith you shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. And this very familiar verse in 1 Peter 5:8, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. And he likes it when Christians are isolated and vulnerable and reeling from some event in their lives, and grief does all those things in our lives. I've often said there are 3 books I think every Christian ought to read. I think you ought to read the Bible first and foremost. If you don't read anything else, read the Bible. But besides the Bible, if you have time to do some outside reading, I, of course, have been greatly blessed by books in the course of my Christian experience. At one point, they were my bread and butter. I just was consuming everything I could and still read for enjoyment and also in my study. But there are 3 classic books. They're all old books that are still in circulation today that every believer ought to try to read if you can. In fact, I will say this. If you've not read one or more of these books, I actually envy you, because there's nothing like reading one of these books for the first time. I was just profoundly impacted by. Now, this is my personal experience. You may have your own list of things, Benita's list probably involves 150 books, but mine's just 3 books. But if I could recommend these to you and you get a chance to read them, great. One of them is In His Steps by Charles Sheldon. It's a tremendous book. That one was written, by the way, in 1896. I didn't know it was that old. But it is declared to be one of the best-selling books of all time. It's, like I said, still in circulation today. You can find it in any Christian bookstore. And it answers the question, what would Jesus do? That became a theme, a popular Christian theme that you saw that on buttons and banners, and churches had themes for that year, all based upon Charles Sheldon's book, In His Steps. And of course, when we figure out what Jesus, or try to figure out what Jesus would do, we can therefore take the necessary steps to do that ourselves in our lives. That's the theme behind that book. The second book is Fox's Book of Martyrs. It's not so much written as compiled by a guy named John Fox. He took real-life incidents and stories of Christians who've given their lives for their faith. And he started way back in the early days of the church. Stephen was the first Christian martyr. And he took the apostles and he went on. And it was written, it's the oldest of the 3 books. It was published, believe it or not, way back in 1563. It was much skinnier back then. They've added additional stories. I have a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs, put out by an Christian organization that gives you current information on people that are being martyred around the world today, in this day and age. And they keep adding to it the stories, the inspiring, fascinating stories of Christians who have given their lives for their faith. And now the book, they keep adding other additional stories on that. It's quite thick if you get a modern day version of it. But it will really challenge your faith. You cannot read that book as a Christian without coming out with the thought, wow, whatever I've had to go through is nothing compared to what people have had to go through. They're giving their very lives for their faith. It's a great book for all Christians to read, Fox's Book of Martyrs. The last one is Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Pilgrim's Progress was written in 1678. It was called the greatest book of Christian allegory that has ever been written. We have it as required reading for some of our literature courses in our academy. And in fact, I should revisit this, several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, maybe longer, I took and taught a whole curriculum. My Bible course for our senior high students in our academy was a compilation of notes and thoughts on the book of Pilgrim's Progress. So I would imagine, how many of you have read Pilgrim's Progress? About half of you. Good. The rest of you need to get that and read it for the first. It's just a great story depicting how the Christian life is sort of a journey. We've talked about that through our process of grief. It's sort of a journey. And he throws in a lot of, and if you get the history behind, I don't have time to get into it now, behind how that book was written and by whom, you will appreciate the tremendous work of literature. This is a guy that was not a writer, like a book writer. He was a preacher, greatly persecuted for his faith. He was imprisoned, and he wrote that book while he was in prison. I would have probably been having a pity party all by myself in that prison, wondering how I'm going to get out of here. He wrote a book that truly inspired, and wrote many other books as well. But it's about a story of a guy named Pilgrim, and his name was changed later to Christian when he became a Christian, in this journey he goes through. And near the tail end of his journey, he is taking this path that's leading him to the valley of the shadow of death. Does that sound familiar? He quoted from Psalm 23, leading him there. He described this the wording is tremendous. On one side was a cliff, a great drop-off along this path. On the other side was a miry bog. And he said that many people, having traveled that path, have wandered off to one side or the other and perished because they left the path and they were misled and they were deceived and taken astray. But he said, he describes this Christian walking through this extremely difficult path, and it's dark, and he hears voices. He calls them fiends, demons, fiends. Can you imagine walking in complete darkness? You can hardly see the path you're traveling on, and you're hearing these voices, and he builds this up in this story. You're actually thinking, this is a scary place for any of us to be, and yet he's describing it as a common experience for all believers walking along this path. And he said at one point in the book, I'll quote from the book, he said, "I will walk in the strength of the Lord God, and the sound of his own prayer is often the only companion in the oppressive silence." I wish I could write like that, Pastor Rocky. I'd be a good author. The only voice he could hear was his own, praying out for God to deliver him in that situation. Hope that inspires you to pick up that book. But there's a reality of perils that we will face, particularly when we go through grief. Sometimes that path is not clear to us. It's obscured and it's dark and there are dangers, and we have to meander through that, just as sheep have to meander through a path like that. So, second, I want you to know the reality of valleys. I want you to see the path through the valleys, how we get through it. As dark as lonely as the valley of the shadow of death may be, there's some things in verse 4 that should encourage us. One of them is this statement: "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Some of you have been walking on this path. We didn't intentionally do this, but we started this series, and several things happened within our church family itself that were unexpected, and I sure didn't know there'd be such a change of events happening among our church family. And you're going through that valley, or have been recently walking through that valley. But the point is that we're going through. We're moving forward. Amen? We're going day by day sometimes, maybe a small step at a time, but we're not stuck in that valley. God doesn't want us to be stuck there. We are making progress, and we are making our way through that valley. Grief is not a stopping place. It's just part of the journey. So those of you that are going through grief right now, it's not where you're going to remain for the rest of your life. It's just part of the journey that God's taking you on right now. David spent a lot of time in that valley. He had many situations in his life where he was in a deep, and he wrote Psalm 23 and as an expression of his experience through this valley that he had been going through. But God got him through that, and David would later on enjoy a wonderful, fruitful, bountiful life as God led him through that valley. Same could be said for Job, you know that story, and Moses, and certainly Joseph, and Gracia Burnham, who I told you about a few weeks ago. She was in a valley for over a year. I mean, not just like, I'm going through a hard time, I'm a little discouraged today. She was a captive prisoner, and there have been several attempts to free her that resulted in bullets flying past her head. And she was urging, when she had a chance to get on, the camera crew came in and filmed her, and she encouraged the militia not to make attempts to rescue them, even though she wanted to be out of bondage for no other reason. She didn't want to be killed. That's how dangerous it got for her on many occasions. And in the course of that time, over a year that she was in that valley, she watched as her husband got killed in a rescue attempt, by the way, in spite of her urgings not to do that. I just can't imagine. She was separated from her children. She said that was the hardest part about it, that knowing that her children were back home wondering how she and her husband were doing, and wondering if she'd ever get released. And but the point is, even though it lasted a long time, she ultimately got through that time of her life, and she's gone on to inspire many people with her story since then. And so will you. You'll get through as well. Oftentimes I give you some verses that might be used for you to refer back to later, or put them in print and put them in a prominent place for those of you that are going through difficult times or will be going through difficult times. This is a good one to have down. I'll give you the reference and I'll read it to you. It's Isaiah 43, verse 2. Here's what it says: "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overthrow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee." Isaiah 43:2 reinforces the fact that we're on the move, folks. Trials come, grief is a part of our life, but it's not a stopping place. It's just part of the journey that we go through, and God is ultimately going to lead us through that. Remember also that verse 4 in David's expression of his experiences, verse 4 comes right after verse 3. So some of you today are parked beside the still waters. Some of you are enjoying the paths of righteousness, and you're laying down in green pastures. For you today, life is wonderful. Life is great. But it doesn't always mean it'll be like that for the rest of your journey. You know, the valley of the shadow of death, verse 4 comes right after verse 3. And that's the nature of life. Many times it's sudden. Many times it's like a slap in the face. We don't expect it. We can't prepare for that, the events that will come into our lives. And God must see us through. It is then we must follow him completely. There's an author by the name of David Gibson who wrote an entire book which was a commentary on the 23rd Psalm. And he said, when we follow the Lord, we cannot fail to be on the right path. If you're following the Lord, you'll be on the right path, even though it has perils and dangers and things, even though it's dark and uncertain. You're on the right path in life if you're following the Lord, and he will most certainly see you through that. So we can't always perceive the presence of the shepherd. Bunyan wrote about that. He said it was dark. The only thing he heard was initially the fiends, the demons around him trying to discourage him, and then the sound of his own voice as he prayed to God. But he said he got to the end of that journey. If you read Pilgrim's Progress, I don't want to be a spoiler, but if you read through that, he gets out of that valley and he comes to a wonderful place and he recognizes that the Lord had been with him all the time. So even when we don't see the Lord active in our lives, it doesn't mean that he's not there involved. Hebrews 13 reminds us, for he has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Paul experienced some of those journeys. He wrote about perils, literally wrote about perils that he had to go through. One of them was a storm at sea, and it's while he was being taken prisoner. So the other side of that journey by sea wasn't like you're going to have a nice vacation time now. He was being taken to be tried. He was taken as a prisoner, and he was treated as a prisoner. And this storm came up, and it was such a bad one. The Bible tells us in the book of Acts that they didn't see the sun or the moon for many days, just nothing but rainy skies and winds blowing and howling, and they felt like this ship was going to go down. They were throwing things overboard, and they just thought for sure they're all going to die. In fact, he said of the men aboard that ship, these seasoned sailors, he said, all hope that they would be saved was lost. You know, after you go through that day after day after day, you're like, we're never going to get out of this storm. It's never going to end. And these hardened sailors all felt like they're all going to die. And he gets up before that group as a prisoner, and all those passengers, about 120-something people aboard that ship, and he says to them this, be of good cheer. Cheer up. Because an angel of God appeared to me and said, we're all going to make it. None of us will perish on this journey. And he was exactly right. The ship broke up. The ship was destroyed, but they all made it to land in Malta. You know this story in the end of the book of Acts, and it was a great, tremendous opportunity for Paul to stand up for the Lord and encourage other people. But let me quote his exact words to the men. He said, for there stood by me this night the angel of the Lord, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. I'll tell you what this world is desperately needing. Some Christians who are going through grief who will stand up and say, I still believe God. I know it's dark. I don't know what all is going to happen. I don't know how this is going to play out, how my life will change, but I'm here to tell you that my God is a faithful God, and I still believe my God, and he's working out his purposes in my life, and I'm going to trust him through my valley. That's what our world is desperately needing, some Christians. What a testimony we can have if we would do that. So God doesn't just lead us to grief, he leads us through grief. And that we can take that encouraging thought. Then I want you to see the shepherd's care in the valleys. The fact that sheep get through a rough valley and make it to these nice places where water is provided and these green pastures is not a tribute to the sheep's intelligence or their abilities or their cunning. Sheep are not the smartest of God's creation. It's funny that God would use that analogy to show that we call us that when he's talking about our relationship with our good shepherd. Sheep are not the brightest. They completely depend upon the knowledge and the instruction and determination of the shepherd to get them to that place of safety. And of course, our great shepherd, will lead us as well. Not all of David's songs are recorded in the Psalms. This is one of them. It's a great one. It's the most familiar one, perhaps. But he wrote other Psalms, many that I believe are not recorded anywhere. And whether or not we'll ever have access to them, I don't know. I don't think David brought his written documents with him when he made it to heaven. Maybe he'll remember some of the things he wrote. Maybe he won't. I don't know. But we do have the benefit of knowing that some of David's Psalms or songs are recorded in books other than the book of Psalms. Did you know that? Trivia. He wrote some songs that are recorded for us in some of those historical books, the 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And he wrote a psalm in 2 Samuel. In his words, he wrote these words down, and I quote, "In the day that the Lord had delivered him out of the hand of all his enemies and out of the hand of Saul." So if you know the story of David, and the backdrop of that story was Saul. So he wrote this psalm. And let me read you, this is not in the book of Psalms, it's in 2 Samuel chapter 22, verses 18 through 20. David wrote these words, "He delivered me from my strong enemy and from them that hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me." You could have attached those words at the end of Psalm 23 and they would have fit in beautifully. Same sentiment, same period of his life perhaps as he was going through. What we need sometimes most of all is just deliverance. Now, when we lose a close loved one or friend, there's a tendency for us to try to, out of loyalty and love, to remain attached to that person. And people do that in different ways. I think you know that. You see people, and you yourselves have tried to honor the life and the legacy of people who have passed on by doing different things. And people go through that process of grief differently. Some people, the pain is so difficult, they kind of want to move on from that period of their lives. And some people do any number of things to stay attached to the person. And I'm all for that. I think there's a place in our lives where we ought to remember and respect the life and legacy of people that have gone on before us and what they meant to us. And whether that's visiting a gravesite or keeping a picture around the house or pulling out some reading material that they sent you or whatever the case may be. People have to do that in their own way and deal with that. And I don't think there's any right or wrong way to do that. But I do want to say this part, for the benefit of those, as we conclude this series on grief, for the benefit of those who've gone through the difficult experience of losing a close loved one and the grief that comes with that situation, that it's important for us not to remain attached to that person on the level of grief. Not to say, I'm being disloyal to that person if I no longer feel sorrowful for their passing, if I no longer hurt in my heart. That the level of attachment that we ought to have for them should not be centered on the matter of grief. You shall not go through that valley forever. But you can stay in that valley longer than you should if your point of contact with that loved one who's passed on is the point of grief. I think I want to encourage you, without being too much of a counselor to you today, or this isn't a therapy session. I think I want to encourage you to focus in and consider the warm thoughts and memories that you have of that person, the things that person left, how they enriched your life, the fact that it's God that takes you through that valley and helps you to move on, the fact that you still have a life to live and others to whom God has entrusted to your care, and that you have to impact their lives and be an example to them. I think it's sometimes unwise of us to stay attached to that level of grief that we had when the person first passed, and then to make sure you don't leave that because you perceive that to be some kind of act of disloyalty. That's not it at all. Particularly when the person knows the Lord, you have the assurance that you'll see them again. I had a young man in our school, been in our school for a while, and we had a Bible class last week, and he expressed some thoughts relative to his sister's passing. And also the fact that he wasn't really sure about his own salvation. Well, we have a student pledge that they have to sign before they enroll in our school that talks about their relationship with the Lord, and that we only want Christian kids in a Christian school. Does that make logical sense to you? It's a Christian school. We have Christian teachers and Christian curriculum, and we want Christian kids in our Christian school. And he made those. I didn't want to address that in my Bible class in front of everybody, but I pulled this young man aside, and I began to talk to him a little bit. We talked about his salvation. I said, what do you think is required for salvation? And he had a grasp of his salvation, but he was a little sketchy on some of the understanding of eternal security. And so we went through the gospel with him, and we got that resolved. And then I said to him, I said, I just want you to know something. I hadn't really thought about it but in the course of this year, but, I lost a sister too. And he looked surprised to hear that. He's still very emotional about it. He lost a 13-year-old sister, 2 years ago maybe, less than that? 3 years ago. 13-year-old sister. She passed. Nobody knows why she passed away. The medical staff thought she was on fentanyl, some kind of drug, because there's no other explanation for why her heart stopped, and it was really rough for the family. It was a dark path for the family during the time that sister passed away. And I looked at him, and I said, I just want you to know, I lost a sister too. And I shared some of my experiences in getting through that with him. And I really connected with him on a level that it's really kind of funny. He's been in the school. He's been under my direct supervision for over a year. And I really liked the young man, but I didn't really feel that close to him until after we'd had that discussion. And unfortunately, he's not returning to our school next year. And I was out making some visits. Oh, by the way, Bev Reed and the Fishers send their love to everybody. Appreciate your prayers for them. They're doing great. The Fishers are doing great. And Bev's literally on her feet again, John. I had a chance to visit with her. She's up on her feet again and doing great. But I was making these visits, so I wasn't there at the end of the school day. And he made it a point to get Mrs. Rocky on the phone because he was disappointed I wasn't there as he was leaving school for the last time yesterday, and he wanted to say goodbye to me. I thought that was kind of cool, But I should make it a point to reach out to him sometime in the near future. But I was trying to share with him that although that was probably the most difficult thing he had gone through to this point in his life, God is going to see him through that. And my sister was only 27 years of age when she passed away. She was the closest Christian friend I had in my life. She was my Christian hero. I was living with her when I first moved to California from Hawaii to go to college, and when I lost her, it was a great loss. But God grows you through that, and he gets you through that. That's what shepherds do. They take us through those times together. So remember, grief is a journey, but it's not a definite destination for us. Okay, we pass through. Quickly, in moving the clock back 1 minute, let me give you the promises of the shepherd found in verses 5 and 6. Let me just say this about that. David had legitimate concerns when he wrote this about death. David understood people wanting to kill him. Now, hopefully, most of us here have never had anybody so angry with us they ever wanted to kill us. That's not the case for David. David had a giant named Goliath who was determined to kill him. David got the best of him, or he would have surely died at the hands of Goliath. David had a king, someone he loyally was faithful to, by the name of Saul, who on multiple occasions tried to kill him. David had the Philistines, who on multiple occasions were out to kill and hated David. And the same thing for the Ammonites. David had a son. What was his name? Absalom, who also tried to kill. David was a guy that was acquainted with scenarios where people were trying to take his life. And yet, through all of that, he said, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." God, you continue to bless me. You don't just protect me. You bless me and you watch over me and you reward me wonderfully, even at times when people, and probably the worst case scenario we can imagine in our lives, are trying to end my life. You're still going to be with me and guide me through those difficult times. Is there a picture of Adoniram Judson? Do we have a picture of, there, you got to look at this. This guy's, I've read his biography more than once. Incredible man. He was acquainted with grief. He went to Burma, and just the medical care that could have been provided or not provided, and the hygiene and the living circumstances were so bad that this man answered the call to be a missionary. He buried 2 of his wives in Burma, and he lost 7 children. Now, I probably would have said, I think God's calling me back to stateside. Or maybe he's from England. God's calling me back to England. I'm going to work among the orphanages in my hometown. Certainly I've given enough. I've lost 2 wives, and 7 children on the mission field. I buried them. He stayed there. Other things happened in his life. You probably know that he lost family members there. The Burmese government was very suspicious of foreigners, and were not very accepting of other religions, most particularly Christianity. So during an Anglo-Burmese war, they accused him of being a spy. They threw him into a vile, filthy, miserable jail for a long period of time, which is why some of his children died. He could not provide for them while he was in prison. He had 30 pounds of chains attached to his legs. And it was just a miserable, difficult time of his life. And he was wrongly accused. I end with this. He had a guy with him, a fellow prisoner with him, who was just as miserable as he was, and unimpressed with the Christian faith and the fact that this man would leave his country and come to Burma to try to reach people with the gospel. And he said to him, "Mr. Judson, what do you think now about the prospect of the conversion of the heathen?" It's kind of like a thief on the cross, you know. If you don't have anything nice to say, just shut up, don't say anything at all, you know. What do you think now? Hey, now you're called to be a missionary to these heathen people. What do you think about these heathen people now? And this is what he said. It's a famous line, and it's attributed to Adoniram Judson. Some of you may have heard this line. Without even a moment's hesitation, he said this: "The prospects are as bright as the promises of God." So I want you to remember that in times of grief. It may look dark. You may not see the end of that tunnel just yet, but the prospects are as bright as the promises of God, and God's promises are wonderful and they're true, and they're plentiful to those of us who go through those valleys. Father, we